Okay, we are at 2:02 and I want to respect everybody's time who is joining us today. And so welcome to those of you who were able to make it today. I want to welcome you to the HETAC webinar addressing the needs of students experiencing homelessness who have disabilities. Happy Friday. Next slide, please. This webinar is being sponsored by the HETAC, or the Homeless Education Technical Assistance Center. For those of you who haven't joined one of our webinars before, the HETAC is funded by the California Department of Education and jointly operated by Contra Costa County Office of Education, which is where I am from, Los Angeles County Office of Education, and San Diego County Office of Education. If you'd like more information on the HETAC, the website is hetac.org, and I will be providing those links throughout this presentation as well. A little bit about me, I'm Denise Clark, Contra Costa County Office of Education. I support the HETAC work here at Contra Costa with our 24 regional COEs. And then joining me today, I'm happy to welcome Nick Berger, who is our Senior Director of Student Programs. And so Nick will be helping me with this presentation today. Thank you very much, Nick. And also want to acknowledge on our call, we have Carlin Scott and Adrian Durley. Carlin is here from County Office of Ed, who will be helping us with the PowerPoint presentation screening, and Adrian will be helping us on Q&A. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted within approximately 1 week on hetac.org. And everybody who's registered for this presentation will always get a follow-up email with the link to this presentation and the recording as well, if you want to share it with your colleagues. All attendees are currently muted. We ask that you do put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. There is also closed captioning if you would like that option. So for today's presentation, we're going to be reviewing the education rights of children and youth guaranteed in the McKinney-Vento Act, as well as the Individuals with Disabilities, or IDEA, Disabilities Education Act. And we're going to primarily be talking about some of the intersections of those policies and practices. We're going to discuss issues relating to immediate enrollment with a student with an IEP, evaluations and services, some of the common issues relating to unaccompanied youth in both McKinney-Vento Act and how that relates to the IDEA provisions. We'll discuss transportation and cost and share some information about the dispute resolution process under McKinney-Vento and due process under IDEA. And just to preface this presentation highly is focused on the HETAC Tip Sheet, which is named in the same title, addressing the needs of students who experience homelessness who have disabilities. And so it does provide a general overview of the information we'll be covering today. This is available on our website as well, hetac.org, as well as other resources and information on the resource tab. And again, we'll be providing those links throughout this session. Next slide, please. And so again, just for some context, a lot of this has to do with eligibility for services. And so McKinney-Vento is where we're going to start, and that is for homeless children and youth. Those are defined as individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And so those of you familiar with McKinney-Vento knows that that includes our families or our youth that are sharing housing due to economic hardship or eviction, shelter, hotel, motels, and substandard housing. And so really the McKinney-Vento eligibility has to do with your housing, your nighttime housing, and if it's fixed, regular, and adequate. Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA is commonly heard, that will determine eligibility for services that have to do with a disability that interferes with children's ability to learn or require specialized instruction so that they can benefit from school. So again, this is the differences in eligibility, and then we'll talk a little bit about how these work together moving forward. Section 504, to be eligible for services for a Section 504 plan, student must have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, have a record of such an impairment, or be regarded as having such an impairment. So again, these are the three areas of eligibility for services, and each has their own services related to those eligibility and qualifications related to those eligibility. So what are the rights and services under McKinney-Vento? A lot of you on this call will probably be familiar with most of these because you received some of this information through the Homeless Education Listserv or through HETAC. But just as a quick review, students experiencing homelessness have the right to receive free, appropriate public education, enroll in school immediately, and that's a big one. We'll touch on that quite a few times throughout the process of this session. But immediate enrollment in school, even if they're lacking documentation, is normally required, and that includes an IEP. So that's where these laws and these practices will overlay a bit. They have the right to enroll at their local school, their school of residence, or continuing attend their school of origin, the school they attended when they were permanently housed, or the school they were last enrolled. And we want to take into account students' best interest in those determination, and we'll go into that a little bit as we go along. Under McKinney-Vento, students can also receive transportation to and from their school of origin if that's requested and if it's a barrier to education. And they can receive educational services comparable to those provided to other students. And so these, again, all the educational rights and services that fall under the McKinney-Vento eligibility component. And then I am going to pass it over to Nick, who's going to talk a little bit about rights and services under IDEA.
Thank you very much, Denise. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nick Berger. I am currently the Senior Director of Student Programs here in the Contra Costa County Office of Education. I am proud to say I have probably 23 years in special education in various positions, and I did serve as a SOPA director for some years in West Contra Costa. So I do get excited about talking about the intersection of special education and students experiencing homelessness. So for this slide, I think this slide discusses the rights and services for students under IDEA, and that special education instruction there's a lot of different ways to provide services. We have students who are served in the general education class with related services. We know we have students who are in full day special education classrooms. We also know that there are specialized schools for students who have disabilities, home hospital instruction for some, and we do know that there are some students who have some of the highest level of special education supports and are actually in out-of-state facilities or different types of institutions. So the schools are required to educate students in the least restrictive environment to the extent possible. So when going through those different scenarios I just discussed, the responsibility of the school is to have them as close to home, as close to their typical peers as possible, while still receiving the instruction that they need or the supports that they need. So some examples of special education supports would be specialized instruction, academic instruction, behavioral support, vocational education. We also talk a lot about related services. Typically, we think about speech, psychological services, physical therapy, counseling, but also I think it's important for this group to be reminded that transportation is also a related service that IEP teams are required to discuss and to make decisions about if that transportation service is necessary for students to receive their free appropriate public education. We also know that there are some students who require medical services or diagnostic or evaluation purposes. So we, kind of in a nutshell, the school districts are responsible for supporting students with all of their needs. So next slide. And this slide discusses the 504s. A 504 plan is different than an IEP, but has some similarities. I've always learned the 504 is a student who would qualify for an IEP but does not need services would be a kid you would consider for as a 504. So here with 504 plans, we talk about different accommodations that could be implemented to make the student, to allow the student to be successful at school. Some examples of accommodations that you would see on 504 plans might be extra time to transition between classes, extra time to complete assignments, access to an elevator, or other ways to support mobility issues. A lot of students are using voice-to-text technology, and then a common one also just being sat near the front of the room to assist with attention, hearing, or visual barriers. So those are some examples of 504 supports. And for the next slide, I'm going to turn it back to you, Denise. I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Thank you. I thought I hit that. I should have hit it twice. Again, a lot of you on this call may or may not be familiar with this poster and the McKinney-Vento Act. But again, the highlight or the key part of McKinney-Vento, always we focus on the immediate enrollment for those students who are either showing up to enroll at school or haven't been out of school for a significant amount of time. Immediate enrollment, even without copies of their documentation, is a primary educational right under McKinney-Vento law. And so again, they could show up at your door, at your school, state that they're in special ed or receiving special education services, but they may not have any of that documentation with them. And you still, under the law, if they meet the federal definition of McKinney-Vento or lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, you would still need to enroll them as soon as possible, even without those documentation. You must provide students with free and appropriate education immediately, again, with that immediate enrollment, and participating fully is also part of the law. And so again, while it might be difficult when they show up and they don't have that documentation, if they do meet the requirements under McKinney-Vento, you do need to process immediate enrollment, move forward, and then work with your district liaison and the previous school to get that IEP and that information as soon as possible, all while they're attending school. And so next slide, please. Some ways you can go about this, and so it might take a few days to get that IEP, and it's recommended that while you're waiting for those records, you can ask the parents or the student, depending on their level of, if they're able to tell you kind of what services they were receiving at that other school. You can pick up the phone, make a phone call, ask who the previous teacher was, and just try to get some of that information while you're waiting for records. But really, to the best of your ability at your school and in consultation with the parents and guardians, you need to get those services started right away and get the student enrolled and back attending and implementing the services as you can become aware of them. And again, all while services are being provided, you can, oh, sorry, back one more. That's okay. And so once that is done and the student's enrolled and they're receiving services and you've obtained a copy of the IEP, you can either, the LEA can either adopt that existing IEP or they can have the option to implement a new IEP. And so there's a process that goes along with that. But the key part here is if they are homeless under McKinney-Vento, to get them enrolled and attending right away, and then work on setting up those services and obtaining that documentation. Next slide, please. School of origin. This is another big one under McKinney-Vento Act, and it applies to students receiving special education just the same way as it applies to any other student that would enroll under McKinney-Vento. And in fact, just want to mention here too, the law IDEA actually includes a provision or references the McKinney-Vento Act in there. And so these two laws are really intended to serve those students who are both special education and McKinney-Vento, and have these two the policies and the practices work together to best support these students. So just, it is actually referenced in there, and they are supposed to work side by side to support these students. And so again, we want to go back to school of origin. This is especially important, these students, for school stability purposes, especially our special education students. We want to make sure that we are definitely utilizing their educational right to stay at the school of origin. They have that right, and is presumed to be in their best interest to continue at that school of origin, unless it is against the wishes of their parent, guardian, or, for McKinney-Vento, unaccompanied youth. And we'll go into that a little bit more with how that relates to special education. But in terms of school of origin, the unaccompanied youth or their parents or guardians have that option to make that decision. But it is presumed to be in their best interest for continuity of care and education to keep them at their school of origin. That is the school they attended before becoming homeless, or the school they last attended within the previous 15 months and were connected with. And so when you're making that determination, of course, you want to consider the particular circumstances and the impact of changing the schools could have. So things we tend to look at are length of commute time, length of enrollment, and services available. But again, we want to assume, unless it is against the wishes of the student or parent guardian, we want to assume that school of origin is the best place to keep that student so they can continue attending and receiving those services while they're experiencing housing instability. Next slide, please. And best interest goes along with school of origin, which I just referenced in the previous slide. Again, under McKinney-Vento, this equally applies to any student, whether or not they have a disability in our LEAs. If they move to an area that's served to a different LEA, they can either continue attending their school of origin, that is in their best interest most of the time. But again, if we need to look at student-centered factors and make that decision based on the individual student. And so we have our cute girl here on the screen, and she's saying that we need to make this about me and my needs. Again, we looked at school of origin, see if that's meeting the student's needs based on the time of year, the age of the student, what services they're currently receiving. Transportation is a big one here, length of commute, age of student, all of those things. You look at school of origin first. If that doesn't seem to be in best interest, and then you start looking at the other options, which would be school of residence or the school closest to where the student is now staying. But yeah, just want to look. It's multifaceted, of course. Every situation is unique and has its own considerations. But again, school of origin and then school of residence, and always taking into account the parent, guardian, or unaccompanied youth and their rights. And so educational decision makers, this is where it gets a little bit different depending on whether we're talking enrollment and attending school of origin, school of residence, or whether we're talking special education rights and services and signing of the IEP. And so in general, we're going to look at our parents or guardians, surrogate parents or temporary surrogate parents. And this is getting more specific to the IEP and the special education services. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Nick.
Thank you, Denise. So with this slide, educational decision makers, under IDEA, the term parent could mean a natural, adoptive, or foster parent. It could mean a guardian, but not the state if the child is a ward of the state. So if the child is a ward of the state, that wouldn't be considered the parent, but if it was a named guardian, that would be considered a parent. An individual acting in place of a natural or adoptive parent, including a grandparent, step-parent, or another relative with whom the child is living, or an individual legally responsible for the child's welfare. So there are times when students, parents have educational rights, but when they're living with their parents or their grandparents, when they're staying with their grandparent would be considered somebody who could act as a parent for special education decision making. An individual assigned to be a surrogate parent can also sign or be an authority when making a decision for an IEP for special education services. And I do just want to add to this slide that when we talk about a parent, oftentimes students have two parents who share educational rights. And with special education, it's only required that one of the parent consent or sign the IEP, and it's not required that both do. So that's that comes up often, and it's important to know as well. So next slide. So parents' rights, again, under IDEA, parents may initiate a request for initial assessment to determine if their child does have a disability, and also must provide informed consent before the evaluation can begin. So they have a right to request it, but they also must consent to the specific assessments being done. They are also entitled to be members of any group that decides whether the child has a disability or meets eligibility. So that would be including them in the IEP meeting, including them in the process, making sure that they're informed, that it's in their own language, and that they understand and consent to the student's eligibility. Parents have a right to participate in IEP meetings related to the evaluations, identification, and placement of the child. And they are entitled to be members of the team that develops, reviews, and revises the IEP, the child's IEP. So next slide. So sometimes when we cannot locate a parent, the parent of a child is not known, or we cannot find them. After making reasonable efforts with good documentation, An LEA is required to appoint someone to act as that child's surrogate parent and educational decision maker. So when districts are assigning a surrogate parent, there are some items they need to be cognizant of. The assigned surrogate parent cannot be an employee of the agency, the LEA, or any other agency that's involved in the education or care of the child. We need to make reasonable efforts to ensure that the assignment of the surrogate not more than 30 days after there's a determination that the child needs the surrogate. So I think this comes from the idea, this reminder in that it sometimes is difficult to find a surrogate, and getting them officially on board and going through the paperwork does take some time. So it would be smart to do that work ahead of time. So in case districts do need a surrogate, you have somebody available who you could lean on that meets these qualifications and understands the role of the surrogate. So next slide. When we have unaccompanied homeless youth, in this case, defined as a homeless child or youth not in physical custody of a parent or guardian, then IDEA, special education law, does allow for the LEA to appoint a temporary surrogate parent until a surrogate parent can be appointed that does meet all of the requirements. Unlike surrogate parents, temporary surrogate parents must be involved in the education or care of the child. So it has to be someone who's aware of the child and aware of the needs and aware of the situation to be a temporary surrogate. And the temporary surrogate parents may include staff from emergency shelters, transitional shelters, independent living programs, or some of the street outreach programs. Next slide. So transportation. There are 3 laws that require transportation for eligible students, and it's important to determine whether the excess cost of the transportation is related to homelessness or to a special education need. So if the excess cost of transportation, or the cost of transportation, is related to the student's housing situation, that the transportation is required because of the housing situation, it would be appropriate to use McKinney-Vento and Title I or Title I Part A funds to cover the costs of the transportation to allow the student to come to school. If the cost of transportation is related to the student's disability and it was a service provided on the IEP, then it would be appropriate to provide the service under IDEA or Section 504. But LEAs must provide transportation to school of origins when students are in that situation upon request. Next slide. So LEA transfers and evaluations. So once a request is received for initial special education or 504 evaluation, the LEA, the school district, has 60 days to complete the evaluation once they have consent from the parent. If the student then enrolls in a different LEA while the evaluation is in process during those 60 days, then the new LEA is not required to complete the assessment within that 60-day time frame. They are required to make a sufficient effort and to continue with the assessment, but they are not required to stick to the 60-day timeline that the previous district was under. It is appropriate for them to reset that 60-day timeline in the new district. Slide. Okay, LEA transfers and IEPs. If a student with an established IEP, so a student who already has an IEP, transfers to a different LEA within the state, the new LEA, the new school district that enrolls him, must provide the student with services comparable to those in the established IEP, and in consultation with the parents. So the enrolling school district has 30 days where they can either adopt the existing IEP or they can develop and implement a new IEP. But during those first 30 days of school, they can operate under the existing IEP from the last school district, and make that decision after 30 days, whether they're going to change the goals, change the services, or whether they will stick to those same services. If a student with an established IEP transfers to a California school district from another state, the enrolling school district must provide with the student with the services comparable until the enrolling LEA conducts an evaluation, if necessary, creates a new IEP. So students coming from out of state, the school district's required to do an evaluation and then come back to the IEP team and recommend services based on the new information. And non-public schools. So under federal and California law, children in special education who are enrolled in private schools are entitled to receive, who are enrolled in private schools are entitled to receive special education service under IDEA. So non-public sectarian schools, non-sectarian schools, NPSs we refer, they are specialized schools that provide services to public school students in California with disability. And I do want to clarify, this does get confusing when we have private schools who are maybe religious-based, or when we have certain types of private schools have different qualifications with special education, but the non-public schools are schools intended to serve students who have high needs of special education. So students with special education needs that are also experiencing homeless shall not be referred to or placed in a non-public school unless the IEP team specifies that that placement is appropriate. And that placement would need to be agreed upon by the educational team and the educational decision maker. All students require the IEP team to be placed in a non-public school, but it's also important to know that students who are in this homeless situation cannot be placed in that school without the IEP team making that decision. And then at least annually, the school district that developed the IEP must consider whether the student's needs continue to be met at a non-public school and whether changes to the IEP are necessary, including whether the student would be transitioned back to the public school. So there is that obligation from the school district every year to review the needs and determine if the non-public school is still necessary. So Denise, I'm going to turn it back to you for dispute resolution.
Okay, and we're going to quickly touch on dispute resolution because both of these, the federal and California state law, established procedures for a dispute resolution process pertaining to McKinney-Vento rights, and there's a separate process pertaining to special education rights. And so we will touch on these briefly, and then we will provide the resource if you wanted to look more in depth into those processes. And so under McKinney-Vento disputes, a parent, guardian, or the unaccompanied youth have the right to dispute a student's McKinney-Vento eligibility. And so if your school or your LEA does not believe a family is McKinney-Vento eligible, still under the law, if they are stating that those are their circumstances and they want to enroll in your school, you still have to process immediate enrollment, and then you can move forward with the dispute resolution. If your LEA disagrees with that, that would be the process there. You still move forward with your immediate enrollment. Another educational right that could be disputed would be school selection. Again, that's your school of origin versus your school of residence for the most part. And so again, if for some reason the school or parent disagrees with school of origin being the appropriate choice for that student that's in transition or lacks housing, again, that would go through the dispute resolution process. Most of the time, families are happy to keep their students at the school of origin, and they need those supports to keep them continuing there. And so sometimes if the school disagrees with the length of transportation or the time of school year or services, that's where you could possibly have a dispute resolution process. And then school enrollment, again, if a family or student is stating that they're meeting the rights of the qualifications of McKinney-Vento, they have lack of fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, they want to enroll at that school, which for most part, this is going to be your school of residence, that they might show up in your local school and say, I want to enroll and I'm staying, just down the street. If your district or school is disputing that information, you still have to process the immediate enrollment, get the student back into school, and all while that's occurring, then the dispute process can take place. Again, we want to get the student back into school, especially if they've been out of school for a prolonged period of time, get them back into school, go through the process, and there's a whole process to follow. And this is ed code cited here. And we also have this information in the tip sheet that we'll provide, but it outlines the specific responsibilities of the LEA related to eligibility, enrollment, and written notice. And families do have to receive a written notice stating what is disputed in the process that they need to go through to finalize that decision. And then there's a different process for the IDEA. And so again, IDEA establishes the right of the education decision maker, the parent, or whoever qualifies as the parent under that list that we reviewed earlier, that they can file a due process complaint that can be related to the special education assessments, their students' eligibility for special education, implementation of the student's IEP, a student's educational placement, or changes made to the student's IEP without educational decision-making approval. And so again, for the McKinney-Vento portion of that, that has to do with eligibility for a lot of times which school they're going to enroll in or stay attending at, and some of the services relating to that. Whereas IDE is going to be a due process complaint if there's disagreement around the assessments, the services of special education, and the IEP and decision maker. And so again, two different processes depending on what you're disputing. For more information on the McKinney-Vento dispute process, we do have a whole website dedicated to this on our HETAC webpage, and I will actually provide that to you now in the chat. So if you're interested in looking at that, you can definitely go there and find a little bit more information on that. And then special education due process. So you would go under the IDEA and visit the California Department of General Services. There is a lengthy webpage there again of how that works and how to file those due process complaints. Next slide, please. And we are doing excellent on time today. And so we do have time for some scenarios, and I had a couple questions. Again, today, just to reiterate, this is a general overview and then touching again on how some of these policies and practices overlay. It would be very difficult to answer a lot of the intricacies that go along with each of these particular circumstances, because we know our McKinney-Vento students and our special education students have varying needs depending on the student and the situation and the LEA they're attending. But we will provide a few scenarios here just for discussion. And so one scenario that we do see quite frequently that we get calls here at our office is if a student, or not frequently, but on occasion, because this tends to, we had a question in the chat actually about this. If a McKinney-Vento student has an IEP and is placed in a non-public school that is not physically located in their school of origin, do they have the rights to continue in that program the following year if they return as a McKinney-Vento student? And to this, the answer is yes. And so that is actually their school of origin, whether it is the LEA that they would normally be attending or it's the school site that the LEA has placed them at due to their what is written into their IEP. Sorry for all the acronyms. But essentially, the district approved an IEP. It placed them in a non-public school. That is the school they were attending when they became homeless. It is now considered under McKinney-Vento, their school of origin. And so as long as their living situation has not changed and there is no specification in McKinney-Vento how long you can be considered eligible under McKinney-Vento for the law, there is no time frame there. And so again, if they return to school the following year, they are still lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. They would still be allowed to attend that school that they were attending previously, regardless of whether or not it's a non-public school. So that's one scenario. And another scenario, which this is where things get a little tricky sometimes with our unaccompanied youth. Under McKinney-Vento, unaccompanied youth have a lot of education rights. They can enroll themselves. They can make educational decisions for themselves under McKinney-Vento. Varies a little bit differently under the special education component, and the parent has the rights there. But if the unaccompanied youth disagrees with his or her parents about the IEP, the question here is, can another adult identified as caregiver, so not parent, caregiver, sign on the IEPs? And usually, and Nick, if you can check in here if I'm misstating anything, but IDEA, again, gives rights to the parent, not the student. And so that's, again, where we differ between the two laws. They aren't quite the same in that way. If the parent's rights have not been terminated and the parent is still acting as the parent, even if they're not physically with that student, and so the student isn't accompanied for McKinney-Vento purposes, parents still retain those education rights. And the school must follow the parent's wishes for anything related to those IEPs and special education, or they'll enter into a mediation or dispute situation. And so again, as I mentioned below there, I just referenced that this is where the two laws can clash a little bit. And some ideas here, because we do have 16, 17, 18-year-olds who may not agree with what their parents are deciding as they hold those educational rights. Or there could be a situation where youth is no longer with parent because they don't feel safe in that household for various reasons. And in those circumstances, hopefully you are able to connect with your district liaison for homeless and your SPED department. And the parent needs to be in those IEP meetings to sign the IEPs, but the student, depending on the scenario, again, if there's issues going on there and they don't want to be in the same vicinity with parent for various reasons, the student does not have to be there, but the parent does. And so just trying to figure out those things ahead of time and see how you can support the student, and then make sure, again, you are recognizing everybody's rights in those two areas. And then just some final thoughts, and then we'll touch on some of these questions we received in the chats. We do have time today, just flying through this, but do want to check in and just didn't really touch on this earlier, but our McKinney-Vento students have a higher rate of having IEPs than other students who are housed. And this is proven in data across the board, across the state and nationally. And they also, this will come no surprise to anybody else, they experience significant barriers even to getting assessed because of their high mobility rates. We want to make sure more than anything that we are reaching out to these students, helping them get their assessments, helping them stay in school if they already are in school and lose housing. Student stability becomes very important. And there's just so many barriers, as you can imagine, with our students who are unhoused, that if we can get them these services at school, it's going to exponentially help them to do better and have that security, at least at school, where they can get the services that they need. And so it's very important to partner intentionally with your SPED or your special education department and your homeless education department. And by that, I mean cross-training each other, having meetings a few times a year, and keeping students on your radar. If we have a special education student that suddenly stops attending school, attendance, of course, can be a huge red flag. And just, again, look at your data is another suggestion here, and see which students are both identified as McKinney-Vento and special education. You can pull that data depending on your role at your LEA, but that data is available. And so just being cognizant of what students those are in your schools is a first step. Watching attendance again, kind of identifying what those barriers are. It goes both ways. And these two departments can work together and should work together to support these students. And then next slide. And so we did quickly run over quite a few things, but it is very heavy here in terms of what the two laws really ensure for your education rights. And we just wanted to provide a general overview, but we do go into a lot of this information in detail on the HETAC Tip Sheet, which we'll be sharing as well. And you can go on the HETAC website at any time, and we do have that information. I also want to point out that there's an overview of special education in California document we'll be providing. There's a really good resource on surrogate parents in special education. That is really important because especially for our homeless education liaisons, if you're working with an unaccompanied youth and there's been multiple attempts to reach their parent, it's not successful, you do have to start going that surrogate parent route because we don't want students to not get those services solely because we can't contact their parent or guardian. And so again, you have to start looking at surrogate parents, and there is a whole section in this guide that will detail, if it's a McKinney-Vento student, kind of the process there. And there is also, it's called the interim or the temporary surrogate parent. And so you can actually, as a district liaison, be a temporary surrogate parent while an actual surrogate parent is being determined. So there are some things that can be done in the interim for our unaccompanied youth while we are trying to identify who the surrogate parent can be. California Department of Education, of course, has a special education website with many resources. The National Center for Homeless Education has a special education website as well. And then I do want to share Schoolhouse Connection has a wonderful webinar that they also did about a month ago, where it goes into a lot of scenarios. And so Schoolhouse Connection is a nonprofit organization that provides a lot of resources and really good scenarios. And so again, while each district or LEA, you do need to go through your processes and then make sure you're in line with your McKinney-Vento and your IDEA law requirements. Schoolhouse Connection has those specific scenarios that people have actually written in real time and discussed situations that are occurring within their LEA, and they give some pretty good guidance there. So just another resource for you. And then we do have time actually for some questions before we get to the end here. And so I was trying to answer some of these in the chat, but let me just bring these up, and then if I missed anything. And so we did have a question in the Q&A that wanted to know, would a district want or need a parent designation document in writing or a caregiver affidavit on file to adequately support authority? And so they were inquiring, and I did ask for a little bit more detail here. And so this was a question I didn't know the answer to, but maybe Nick does. I know the McKinney-Vento side, but in terms of IEPs and that list of who could qualify as a parent, is there any specific documentation required in terms of designating that person as a parent?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And it is best practice to really show that you've done your research when it is appropriate to ask when looking for who has educational rights to actually see documents. There isn't like a database where you can go find this, but there is the idea that you have to do your due diligence to ensure that you have the right information, or that you're vetting the information that's given to you. So traditionally, you will do your very best to get the paperwork to include in the file if a certain parent has educational rights or doesn't have educational rights, or if there's a surrogate assigned, there is a document that you keep on the record that surrogate was assigned. So there isn't like a central place for that, but you do want to make sure that you're providing as much documentation as possible, or if not, providing documentation that you attempted to get that documentation as you're moving forward.
And then so there's not necessarily an affidavit or anything like that they have to sign up. Okay.
Yes.
And that is similar for on the McKinney-Vento side, as you know, for enrollment purposes. Again, a student who's unaccompanied youth in that situation could enroll themselves without having a caregiver affidavit, a parent signature, anything. They can enroll themselves without any of that required documentation as well. And then just to share with the group, we also had a question. Could an NPS be considered the school of origin? And yes, it can be. So if that's the school that the student was attending prior to becoming homeless, then that would be considered their school of origin, whether or not it's an NPS or a public school site. Let me see if there's any other questions here. I was expecting a few more questions.
Denise, I did answer one question about if a student is 18. And I did put in the comments that an 18-year-old student who is not conserved they do get to sign their own IEPs. So as an 18-year-old, they are an adult and they are not required to have a parent sign their IEP because they're considered an adult student at 18.
Clarifying. I'll double check if we have any more questions.
I saw one question about miles, about the distance. So
Yeah.
when they're making that determination of should a student be in the school where they just moved to, or should they remain in their school that they were in? I have not heard that there's a distance requirement, but I think distance is something that you consider when you have the meeting. Is this in the student's best interest to travel for an hour or travel for half an hour to get to school?
Yeah, and I'd echo the same thing. There is nothing in the law that specifies an exact number of miles, but again, we'd want to go back to the best interest determination for the McKinney-Vento side. All things that come into consider the length of transport, the timing it's going to take to get to school, what types of transportation would be available, and the student's age, all of those things go back to the best interest consideration, with school of origin being the presumed, best interest placement. But yeah, there's nothing in law you could, which we do, transport student across county lines because that is in their best interest. If it's a high school senior and they want to graduate, and you need to help support that because that's what's in their best interest. And so, yeah, there's nothing defined there to limit that, just if it will be best for them or not. And then let me see if there's anything else we missed. Any other questions? No, so far. I'm going to put a few more resources in the chat while we're here. And so I did want to include the links to the dispute resolution process for McKinney-Vento. So you have that as well. And the link to the special education due process. And then just to reiterate, we will be posting a video version of this and the slide deck on the HETAC website. I do anticipate that we'll be offering the session again next year. We're working on some webinars for next year. The links, yes, those links are available on the HETAC website as well. And so what we've done for HETAC is we curated quite a few resources for special education. We have a lot of resources depending on your topic, but special education is one of the tabs on that resource page. And so we will continue to populate that information, primarily for our homeless education liaisons, but it is good information for anybody to have. And then I'll also just share as a liaison that has worked to support in our county. You definitely want to coordinate with your special education folks. We want to make sure we're doing this in the best interest of the students. And if funding becomes an issue, there are ways to work together to blend funding to support, depending on what, if the need is based on their McKinney-Vento eligibility, there's Title I and McKinney-Vento funding to support that need. And then we want to make sure that that's supporting their school stability. And so again, just intentionally partnering and making sure that we're supporting these students the best way we can. And thank you, Nick, for commenting. Yes, we will get those up on the website soon. Any other questions? All right. Not seeing any questions here. But again, feel free. There is also a Q&A feature on the HETAC website. And so if a question comes up after today, you can definitely submit questions through the website as well, and we can follow up with you. But we will give it another minute or two just to see if anything else comes up. Okay. Well, we really appreciate you all joining us today on your Friday. I know it's been probably a long week for some folks, and we appreciate your time and your interest in this subject matter. Feel free to reach out to myself or through HETAC, and if there's any further support we can provide to you regarding the intersections of homeless education and special education, we are happy to do so. And so with that, I want to thank Nick for joining us and all your expertise. Thank you so much. And
Glad to be here. Thank you very much.
thank you. And we want to wish you all a great weekend, and we'll see some of you at the Homeless Conference next week down in San Diego, I hope. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.